My dear friends in Christ, welcome back to Making Space version 3.0 with Deacon Evan Ponton. We're having a series of interviews this week with this wonderful deacon and good friend of mine who's going to be ordained a priest of Jesus Christ on August 22nd in the Archdiocese of Baltimore at the Cathedral of Mary, our Queen. And so we'd like to talk today about something that every deacon and priest must do at his ordination, and it is to promise obedience to the bishop who is ordaining him and to his successor. And so, Deacon Ponton, let us know, let our viewers know too, please, what does it mean to promise obedience?
Yeah, the word obedience, it comes from a Latin word meaning ob audire, which means to listen.
Yeah.
And that's something more than just kind of hearing, but really listening. So I think that's the heart of what obedience means. It means really an active listening to one another. I think that's a good place to begin a little reflection for all of us, because we live in a very loud and noisy world where I think we like to talk a lot, but we don't always listen very much. And we need to ground that virtue of obedience, the obedience of faith that St. Paul so beautifully talks about in his letters. The obedience of faith in Christ is really rooted in a listening heart to one another. And I think that's important, one, because if we don't ground it in listening, then obedience, which is a virtue, really degenerates into a kind of just thoughtless repetition, a kind of feeling like you're always simply being commanded, that you lose yourself in your agency.
Like a sense of servile submission.
Right.
As opposed to an active surrender of will to God.
And so I think that promise of obedience that we make as deacons and as priests, as the per se, you're promising respect and obedience to your bishop and his successors, is a very countercultural call, because obedience is not a really popular concept today. We really value our sense of autonomy and independence, but not in a way I think that leads to authentic freedom.
Correct.
And so that obedience to a bishop that we make, which is really a form of obedience to Christ, is the pathway to freedom in the spirit. A spiritual freedom that really exceeds all kind of worldly ideas of freedom or kind of mere license.
Which frees us to be able to serve others better and more willingly and more lastingly. Like at a moment's notice, our bishop could simply say, as he most recently did for me, "We need you now, please, to move from this parish to this parish. What do you say?" "Yes, Bishop." Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
I promised obedience. Yes, Bishop.
And that's a wonderful thing, because you're exactly right, that a vow of obedience frees us for the important work of ministry.
Correct. And to be available to all people at any time.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so I think as a seminarian, as a deacon, reflecting on obedience, that's been something that has really changed in my process, and that's a good thing, because it's a process of maturing.
Absolutely.
Of thought. And in the same way that a husband and wife need to be obedient to one another as a sign of their faithfulness to one another.
And so then the priest or deacon and priest are obedient to the bishop, who is obviously the agent of God and the church. And so in our own obedience, there's holiness. Holiness comes from obedience. We see that so powerfully with Jesus, who once he's 12 and he's found preaching in the temple, Mary and Joseph find him and they wonder, why are you here? And when they tell him to come home with them, he does. And St. Luke specifically mentions that he is obedient to them. He is obedient to them. And so, my dear friends in Christ, St. Benedict begins his beautiful rule by saying, listen with the ear of your heart. Obey God by listening with the ear of your heart. And when you and I listen with the ear of our heart, my dear friends in Christ, you and I, we make space for grace.